The rain was hitting the old barn roof like tiny hammers, and Thomas could hear every single drop. He pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders and tried to ignore the cold wind coming through the gaps in the wooden walls. This wasn't how he thought his life would turn out when he was younger. Just 3 years ago, Thomas had been living in a nice 2-story house with his wife, Linda. He was a boxer then, not famous or anything, but good enough to make decent money fighting in local matches. People knew his name around town. They would wave at him on the street and ask about his next fight. Linda would come to every match, sitting in the front row, cheering louder than anyone else. Their house had 3 bedrooms, a big kitchen where Linda loved to cook, and a backyard where they planned to build a deck someday. Thomas had his own training room in the basement with a heavy bag, speed bag, and all his equipment. On the walls were photos from his fights and newspaper clippings about his wins. Linda had framed them all and hung them up with pride. But then everything changed when Linda got sick. It started with headaches that wouldn't go away. She said it was probably just stress from her job at the school where she worked as a teacher, but the headaches got worse, and then came the dizzy spells. When she finally went to the doctor, they found something nobody wanted to hear about: cancer. The word hit Thomas like a punch he never saw coming. The doctor said they could treat it, but it would be expensive. Really expensive. Thomas had some savings, but not nearly enough for what Linda needed. He sold his car first, then his boxing equipment. When that wasn't enough, he took out loans against their house. Linda fought hard. She went through treatment after treatment, always staying positive, always smiling even when she felt terrible. Thomas stopped boxing to take care of her full-time. He didn't care about his career anymore. All that mattered was helping Linda get better. He would drive her to appointments, hold her hand during treatments, and stay up all night when she couldn't sleep because of the pain. For a while, it looked like the treatments were working. Linda's energy came back a little, and she even started talking about going back to teaching. They were both hopeful. Thomas started thinking about maybe returning to boxing once Linda was completely healthy again. They made plans for the future, talking about taking a vacation somewhere warm when everything was over. But the cancer came back worse than before. The doctors tried everything they could, but nothing worked. Linda spent her last few weeks in the hospital, and Thomas never left her side. He slept in the uncomfortable chair next to her bed every night. He held her hand and talked to her about all the good times they had together. When she died, Thomas felt like half of his heart had been ripped out. The medical bills were enormous. Even with insurance, Thomas owed more money than he could ever pay back. The hospital wanted their money, and so did the doctors and the treatment centers. Thomas had borrowed against everything he owned, and now the bills were due. He tried to work, taking whatever jobs he could find, but it wasn't enough. The numbers were just too big. 6 months after Linda died, Thomas lost their house. He had to watch strangers come and put all their belongings in a truck and drive away. The photos from their life together, Linda's books, their furniture, everything that made their house a home was gone. Thomas took only what he could carry in 2 suitcases and a backpack. For a few weeks, he stayed in cheap motels, paying by the night. But even that was too expensive when you don't have steady work. Thomas found himself sleeping in his old truck in parking lots behind stores. Security guards would knock on his windows and tell him to move along. He felt embarrassed and ashamed, but he didn't know what else to do. When his truck finally broke down and he couldn't afford to fix it, Thomas became truly homeless. He wandered around town looking for somewhere safe to sleep. That's when he found the old barn on the edge of town. It belonged to a farm that had been abandoned years ago. The farmer had died and his family had moved away, leaving the property empty. The barn was falling apart, but it had a roof and walls that mostly kept out the rain. Thomas found some old hay bales to use as furniture and made himself a small corner where he could sleep. It smelled like old animals and dust, but it was better than sleeping outside in the cold. People in town started noticing him around. At first, some folks remembered him from his boxing days and felt sorry for him. They might buy him a meal or give him a few dollars. But as time went on and Thomas looked more and more like what people think a homeless person looks like, their sympathy turned into something else. His clothes got dirty because he had no way to wash them properly. His hair grew long and messy. He lost weight because he couldn't afford to eat regularly. When people saw him walking through town, they would cross the street to avoid him. Store owners would watch him carefully when he came in, thinking he might try to steal something, The worst part was when people would recognize him from his boxing days. "Isn't that the fighter who used to live on Maple Street?" They would whisper to each other. "Look at him now. What a shame." Some people seemed almost happy to see someone who used to be successful fall so far down. Thomas tried to find work, but it was hard when you don't have an address or clean clothes or a way to shower regularly. Employers would take one look at him and make excuses about why they couldn't hire him. He ended up doing odd jobs for cash when he could find them, moving furniture, cleaning gutters, shoveling snow in the winter. Whatever people would pay him to do. The teenagers in town were the worst. They thought it was funny to have a homeless person living in the old barn. Sometimes they would ride their bikes out there and throw rocks at the walls just to scare him. They would yell things like, "Hey, crazy man," or "Get a job." Thomas never responded. He just stayed quiet and waited for them to get bored and leave. Every night, Thomas would lie on his makeshift bed in the barn and think about Linda. He would remember how she used to make coffee in the morning and how she would hum while she got ready for work. He missed everything about their life together. Sometimes he wondered if Linda would be disappointed in how far he had fallen. But then he would remember how kind she was, how she always helped people who were struggling, and he knew she would understand. The hardest part wasn't being poor or homeless or hungry. The hardest part was feeling invisible. People looked right through him like he wasn't even there. It was like losing Linda had made him disappear from the world too. But Thomas kept going day after day because something inside him refused to give up completely. He didn't know why yet, but something told him this wasn't the end of his story. Thomas woke up every morning at sunrise, not because he wanted to, but because the barn got cold before dawn, and staying warm meant moving around. He had learned to fold his few clothes into a pillow and use old newspapers as blankets. The hay bales he slept on weren't comfortable, but they were better than the hard ground. His daily routine had become a careful dance of survival. First, he would walk to the gas station on Route 9 about 2 miles from the barn. The owner, Pete, was one of the few people who still treated him like a human being. Pete would let Thomas use the bathroom and sometimes buy a small coffee for 50 cents when he had the money. The coffee was usually old and bitter, but it was hot and gave him energy for the day. After the gas station, Thomas would walk through town looking for work. He had learned which neighborhoods might have people who needed help with yard work or small repairs. Fall was the best time because people wanted their leaves raked and their gutters cleaned before winter. Spring was good too, with people doing cleanup after the snow melted. But winter and summer were hard times when nobody seemed to need anything done. Mrs. Patterson on Oak Street was one of his regular customers. She was an elderly lady whose husband had died a few years back. Her yard was too big for her to handle alone, and her grown children lived too far away to help. Every few weeks she would have work for Thomas. She paid him fairly and always offered him a sandwich when he was done. She never made him feel ashamed about his situation. But for every Mrs. Patterson, there were 10 people who looked at Thomas like he was dangerous or dirty. When he knocked on doors asking about work, most people wouldn't even open them all the way. They would peek through the crack and say they didn't need anything, even when he could see their yards were full of leaves or their gutters were overflowing. The grocery store was one of the worst places to go. Thomas only went there when he absolutely had to buy something. The security guard would follow him around the store like he was planning to steal something. Other customers would grab their purses tighter when they saw him coming down the aisle. The cashiers would barely look at him when he paid for his items, always counting his money twice like they thought it might be fake. One day, Thomas was in line behind a woman with 2 young children. The little boy, maybe 5 years old, pointed at Thomas and asked his mother loudly, "Why does that man look so dirty?" The mother quickly shushed her son and pulled him closer to her, but not before giving Thomas a look that made it clear she thought he was some kind of threat to her family. The barber shop where Thomas used to get his haircut was another painful reminder of how much his life had changed. Tony, the barber, had cut Thomas's hair for almost 10 years when he was boxing. They used to talk about sports and local news while Tony worked. Now when Thomas walked past the shop, Tony would pretend not to see him through the window. One time Thomas went in to ask if Tony needed any help cleaning up, and Tony just shook his head and said he was all set, not even looking up from sweeping the floor. Downtown, there was a diner called Rosie's, where Thomas and Linda used to go for breakfast on Sunday mornings. Linda loved their pancakes, and Thomas always got the same thing: 2 eggs over easy, bacon and toast. The waitresses knew them by name and would bring their coffee before they even sat down. Now when Thomas walked past Rosie's, he could see people inside eating and laughing, living normal lives. He never went in because he knew he couldn't afford it, and he was afraid of how the staff might treat him. The library became one of Thomas's favorite places during the day. It was warm in winter and cool in summer, and the librarians didn't bother him as long as he was quiet. He would sit at the tables and read newspapers or magazines, trying to keep his mind sharp and stay connected to the world. Sometimes he would use the computers to look for jobs online, though most of them required an address and phone number he didn't have. But even at the library, Thomas felt the stares and whispers. Parents would move their children away from where he was sitting. Students doing homework would choose tables far from his. The security guard would walk by his table more often than necessary, just to make sure he wasn't causing any trouble. Finding places to eat was always a challenge. Thomas had learned which restaurants threw away their old food and when they did it. Behind the pizza place, he could sometimes find whole pizzas that were made wrong or not picked up. The sandwich shop would throw away perfectly good bread and lunch meat at closing time. Thomas felt ashamed digging through garbage for food, but hunger was stronger than pride. The worst times were when he ran into people he used to know from his boxing days. There was Jerry, who used to train at the same gym. Jerry saw Thomas picking up cans along the highway one day and pulled over his car. But instead of offering help, Jerry just shook his head and said, "Man, I heard you fell on hard times, but I didn't know it was this bad." Then he drove away, leaving Thomas standing there with a bag of empty cans worth maybe $2. Some of his old boxing buddies would cross the street when they saw him coming. These were guys he had shared victories and defeats with, guys who used to slap his back and buy him drinks after fights. Now they acted like his bad luck might be contagious, like talking to him might somehow bring their own lives crashing down. The teenagers in town had made tormenting Thomas into a regular entertainment. They had names for him now, Barn Boy and Crazy Fighter. They would ride their bikes out to his barn and bang on the walls with sticks. Sometimes they brought friends to show off their discovery of the homeless man living like an animal. Thomas would hide in the back corner when he heard them coming, waiting for them to get bored and leave. One evening, a group of kids spray-painted "Loser" on the side of the barn where Thomas could see it from his sleeping spot. They also left empty beer bottles and trash around the property, like they were marking their territory. Thomas cleaned it up the next morning because he didn't want to live surrounded by garbage, but the word "loser" was painted too thick to scrub off easily. The changing seasons made everything harder. Winter was brutal, because the barn had no heat and the wind cut right through the walls. Thomas would do jumping jacks and push-ups to stay warm, remembering his boxing training. Spring brought rain that leaked through holes in the roof, and Thomas learned to position buckets and old containers to catch the water. Summer was hot and stuffy, with flies and mosquitoes making sleep almost impossible. Through it all, Thomas held on to two things that kept him going. First was a small photo of Linda that he kept in his jacket pocket. It was from their wedding day, and she was smiling that bright smile that had made him fall in love with her. He would look at it when things got really bad and remember that he had been loved completely by someone wonderful. The second thing was his old boxing gloves. They were the only piece of his former life he had managed to keep. Late at night in the barn, when he couldn't sleep, Thomas would put them on and shadow box in the dim light. His body remembered the movements even though he was thinner and weaker now. The gloves reminded him that he had once been strong, that he had once been somebody people cheered for. But even with those reminders of who he used to be, Thomas felt himself disappearing more each day. It was like becoming homeless had made him invisible to most people. They looked right through him or past him like he was just part of the scenery. Sometimes Thomas wondered if he really was becoming nothing, if this was how his story would end. Forgotten and alone in an old barn, slowly fading away until nobody remembered he had ever existed at all. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when Thomas first saw the black car. He was sitting outside the barn, trying to fix a hole in his jacket with some thread he had found, when he noticed a shiny sedan driving slowly down the dirt road toward his place. Thomas quickly stood up and looked around for somewhere to hide. Usually when cars came down this road, it meant trouble. Either the teenagers coming to bother him or someone telling him he had to leave. The car stopped about 50 feet from the barn, and Thomas watched nervously as the driver's door opened. To his surprise, an elderly woman stepped out. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and wearing a long, dark coat that looked expensive. She definitely didn't belong on this muddy farm road, and Thomas couldn't figure out why she was here. The woman looked around carefully, like she was making sure she was in the right place. Then she started walking toward Thomas. She moved slowly but steadily, using a walking stick to help her on the uneven ground. Thomas thought about running, but something about the way she carried herself made him stay put. She didn't look angry or scared. If anything, she looked determined. When she got close enough to speak, the woman stopped and looked directly at Thomas. "Are you Thomas Rivera?" she asked in a clear, strong voice. Her accent was educated, the kind of voice you heard on the news or in courtrooms. Thomas was so surprised to hear someone use his full name that he just nodded without thinking. "My name is Catherine Wells," the woman continued. "I'm a retired attorney, and I've been looking for you for quite some time. Would it be possible for us to talk privately?" Thomas didn't know what to say. Nobody had been looking for him except maybe bill collectors, and this woman definitely wasn't a bill collector. He glanced toward the barn, embarrassed about his living situation. "I don't really have anywhere nice to sit and talk," he said quietly. Catherine smiled, and her whole face changed. The serious lawyer expression was replaced by something much warmer and kinder. "That's perfectly fine. I don't mind standing, or we could sit on those hay bales if you'd prefer. What I have to discuss with you is quite important, and I don't care where we do it." Thomas led her to 2 hay bales near the barn entrance. Catherine sat down carefully, placing her walking stick beside her and smoothing out her coat. She opened a leather briefcase that Thomas hadn't noticed she was carrying and pulled out a thick folder. "Thomas, I need to ask you about your wife, Linda Marie Rivera, who passed away about 2 years ago." Catherine's voice was gentle but professional. "I understand this might be difficult to talk about, but it's very important." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He didn't like talking about Linda with strangers, especially not with someone who might be connected to the medical bills or the debt collectors. "What do you want to know about her?" he asked suspiciously. Catherine seemed to understand his hesitation. "I want you to know right away that this has nothing to do with any debts or legal troubles you might have. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I'm here because of something very good that has happened, though it's going to be hard to believe at first." She opened the folder and pulled out several documents. Thomas could see official-looking papers with seals and signatures, but he couldn't read them from where he was sitting. "Thomas, what did Linda tell you about her family? Her parents, grandparents, any relatives?" Thomas thought back to all their conversations over the years. Not much. Her parents died when she was young, and she was raised by her grandmother. The grandmother died when Linda was in college. She always said she didn't have any other family, that it was just her and me against the world. He smiled sadly, remembering how Linda used to say that phrase when they were facing difficult times. Catherine nodded like this information was exactly what she expected to hear. "Linda was raised by her maternal grandmother, Dorothy Chen, is that correct?" "Yes, that's right. Grandma Dorothy. Linda loved her very much. She raised Linda from the time she was 8 until she went to college." "And did Linda ever mention Dorothy's maiden name, or anything about Dorothy's parents?" Thomas shook his head. "Linda said Grandma Dorothy didn't like talking about the past. She had come from China when she was young and had a hard life before she settled here. Linda always figured there were painful memories that her grandmother didn't want to share." Catherine was quiet for a moment, looking through her papers. "Thomas, Dorothy Chen's maiden name was Dorothy Blackwood. She was the daughter of a man named Harrison Blackwood, who became very wealthy in real estate development. Dorothy left her father's house when she was 18 after a terrible argument, and she never spoke to him again. She changed her name to Chen when she married Linda's grandfather." Thomas was confused. "Okay, but I don't understand why you're telling me this. Those people are all dead now." "Harrison Blackwood died 6 months ago," Catherine continued. "He was 93 years old and worth approximately $200 million. For the last 30 years of his life, he had been trying to find his daughter Dorothy and make amends for whatever drove her away. He hired private investigators and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars looking for her. Thomas felt like the world was spinning around him, but Dorothy died years ago. Yes, she did. And when Harrison's investigators finally found that out, they learned about Linda. Harrison was overjoyed to discover he had a granddaughter. He made plans to contact her and welcome her back into the family. He wanted to give her everything: money, properties, a chance to understand her family history. Catherine paused and looked directly at Thomas. But Linda died before Harrison could reach her. He was devastated. He blamed himself for waiting too long, for not trying harder to find Dorothy earlier. Harrison died 6 months later, some say from a broken heart. Thomas was having trouble processing what Catherine was telling him. "I still don't understand why you're here talking to me." Catherine smiled again, that same warm smile that had surprised him earlier. Thomas, Harrison Blackwood's will was very specific. He left everything to Dorothy. And if Dorothy was deceased, then to Dorothy's children. If Dorothy's children were deceased, then to their surviving spouses. Linda was Harrison's only heir, and now that she's gone, you are. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He stood up quickly, shaking his head. "No, that can't be right. You must have the wrong person. Linda didn't have any rich relatives. We would have known. We were broke, completely broke. We lost everything paying for her medical bills." Catherine stood up too, but she moved slowly and kept her voice calm. "I know this is shocking, Thomas. I know it's hard to believe. That's exactly why I've been looking for you for months. I had to make sure I had the right person before I could tell you what I'm telling you now." She handed him one of the documents from her folder. "This is a certified copy of Harrison Blackwood's will. This other document is a genealogy report showing the family connection. And this," she handed him a photograph, "is a picture of Dorothy when she was young. Do you see the resemblance to Linda?" Thomas looked at the photograph and his hands started shaking. The young woman in the picture had Linda's eyes, Linda's smile, even the same way of tilting her head slightly when she was happy. It was like looking at Linda in an old-fashioned dress. "The lawyers handling Harrison's estate have been trying to find you since he died," Catherine continued. "I was hired to track you down because I specialize in finding missing heirs. It took me months because because you're not living in a way that makes you easy to find through normal channels." Thomas sat back down on the hay bale heavily. His mind was racing, but he couldn't make sense of what he was hearing. "You're saying that Linda's family was rich? That Linda was supposed to inherit all this money?" "Not just money, Thomas. Properties, investments, businesses. Harrison Blackwood owned half the downtown area in 3 different cities. He had shopping centers, office buildings, apartment complexes. And according to his will, all of it now belongs to you." Thomas looked around at the falling down barn, at his patched clothes and his few belongings scattered on hay bales. Then he looked back at Catherine in her expensive coat with her briefcase full of official documents. It felt like some kind of cruel joke. "Why should I believe any of this?" he asked finally. "How do I know you're not trying to scam me somehow?" Catherine reached into her briefcase again and pulled out a business card and another document. "This is my card with my law firm's address and phone number. You can call them and verify that I am who I say I am. This document gives you the contact information for the law firm handling Harrison's estate. You can call them too. In fact, I encourage you to do exactly that before you trust anything I'm telling you." She stood up and smoothed out her coat again. "Thomas, I know this is overwhelming. I know it seems impossible. But I've been a lawyer for 45 years, and I've never been more certain about anything in my professional life. You are Harrison Blackwood's heir, and you are about to become a very wealthy man." Catherine walked back toward her car, then turned around one more time. "I'm going to leave these documents with you to look over. Take your time. Call the numbers I gave you. When you're ready to talk again, call me. But Thomas, don't wait too long." Thomas spent the entire night staring at the documents Catherine had left with him. He had found an old flashlight in the barn, and he read every word on every page at least 3 times. The legal language was confusing, but certain phrases kept jumping out at him. Sole beneficiary, $200 million, all real estate holdings, and immediate transfer upon verification. When morning came, Thomas walked to the gas station to use Pete's phone. His hands were shaking as he dialed the number for Harrison Blackwood's law firm. A receptionist answered with a crisp, professional voice. "Blackwood Estate Legal Services, how may I help you?" Thomas cleared his throat nervously. My name is Thomas Rivera, and I think you might be looking for me." There was a pause, then the sound of papers shuffling. "Thomas Rivera? Sir, please hold on just one moment." The hold music seemed to last forever. Thomas was starting to think the whole thing was some kind of mistake when a man's voice came on the line. "Mr. Rivera, this is attorney David Morrison. We have been trying to locate you for months. Are you calling from a secure location where we can speak privately?" Thomas looked around the gas station. Pete was busy with customers and couldn't hear him. Yes, I think so. Mr. Rivera, I need to verify your identity before we can discuss the estate. Can you tell me your wife's full maiden name and the date of her death? Thomas answered the questions, along with several others about Linda's birthday, where they were married, and details that only he would know. With each correct answer, the lawyer's voice became more excited. Mr. Rivera, I cannot tell you how relieved we are to finally reach you. Mr. Harrison Blackwood left very specific instructions about finding you. Are you familiar with the details of your inheritance? A lady named Catherine Wells came to see me yesterday. She told me some things, but honestly, I don't believe any of it. It doesn't seem real. Attorney Morrison's voice was warm and reassuring. Mr. Rivera, I can understand your skepticism. What Mrs. Wells told you is absolutely true. You are the sole heir to one of the largest estates in the state. Would it be possible for you to come to our office today? We have been holding these assets in trust waiting for you, and there are many things we need to discuss. Thomas looked down at his dirty clothes and thought about his situation. I don't really have transportation, and I'm not dressed appropriately for a law office. Mr. Rivera, please don't worry about any of that. We can send a car for you, and clothing is not important right now. What's important is getting you the help you need and starting the process of transferring your inheritance. Where can we pick you up? 2 hours later, Thomas was sitting in the back of a luxury sedan, being driven through parts of the city he had never seen before. The driver was polite and professional, treating Thomas like an important client despite his appearance. They pulled up to a glass building downtown with the name Morrison Burke and Associates in gold letters across the front. Inside, the lobby was all marble and expensive furniture. The receptionist smiled at Thomas like he was someone special and offered him coffee or water. Thomas felt completely out of place, but everyone was treating him with respect he hadn't experienced in years. Attorney Morrison was a tall man with gray hair and a kind face. His office was filled with law books and had windows that looked out over the whole city. He shook Thomas's hand warmly and invited him to sit in a comfortable leather chair. Mr. Rivera, before we begin, I want you to know that everything I'm about to tell you is real. I understand this must be overwhelming, but you have my word that this is not a joke or a scam. You are about to become one of the wealthiest men in the state. Morrison opened a thick file on his desk. Harrison Blackwood was a remarkable man who built an empire from nothing. He started with one small apartment building 50 years ago and turned it into a massive real estate portfolio. When he died, his holdings were valued at just over $200 million. Thomas tried to wrap his mind around that number. $200 million? That's more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Mr. Blackwood spent the last 30 years of his life trying to reconnect with his family. He deeply regretted whatever happened between him and his daughter Dorothy. When he learned about Linda, he was determined to make things right with the next generation. He planned to give her everything and help her understand her family history. Morrison pulled out a thick photo album. Mr. Blackwood compiled this over the years. These are pictures of Dorothy when she was young, family documents and letters he wrote to her but never sent. He wanted Linda to know that she came from a family that loved her, even if they were separated by pride and misunderstanding. Thomas looked through the album with amazement. There were dozens of pictures of Linda's grandmother Dorothy, and the resemblance to Linda was unmistakable. There were also pictures of Harrison himself, a serious-looking man who seemed to carry a lot of sadness in his eyes. Mr. Blackwood left very specific instructions about what should happen if Linda predeceased. Morrison continued. He said that Linda's husband should receive everything, because anyone Linda chose to marry must be a good person worthy of the family fortune. He believed that Linda's judgment about people was probably better than his own had ever been. Morrison handed Thomas another document. This is a complete list of your assets, Mr. Rivera. 3 shopping centers, 2 downtown office buildings, 4 apartment complexes, and a portfolio of stocks and bonds. There's also Mr. Blackwood's personal residence, which is a 15-room mansion on 20 acres outside the city. Thomas stared at the list, unable to process what he was reading. This has to be a mistake. Poor people like me don't inherit mansions and shopping centers. This kind of thing doesn't happen to real people. Mr. Rivera, it is happening to you. And there's more. Mr. Blackwood established a trust fund that generates approximately $2 million in income every year. That money has been accumulating since his death, waiting for you. You already have over $1 million in cash available immediately. Thomas felt dizzy. He put his head in his hands and tried to breathe normally. I was living in a barn yesterday. People throw rocks at me and call me names. I dig through garbage for food. How can you tell me I'm suddenly worth hundreds of millions of dollars? Morrison came around the desk and sat in the chair next to Thomas. Mr. Rivera, I've been practicing law for 30 years and I've handled many estate cases. But I've never been more moved by a situation than I am by yours. Mr. Blackwood would be overjoyed to know that his fortune is going to someone who truly understands what it means to struggle and suffer. The lawyer pulled out yet another document. There's something else, Mr. Rivera. Mr. Blackwood left a personal letter for Linda's husband. He wrote it 2 years ago when he first learned about Linda's death. Would you like me to read it to you? Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice to speak. Morrison unfolded a handwritten letter and began to read in a steady voice. To the man who loved my granddaughter Linda. I know we will never meet, but I want you to know that I am sorry. I am sorry that my pride and stubbornness cost me the chance to know Dorothy and Linda. I am sorry that you and Linda struggled financially while I sat on a fortune that should have been helping you. Most of all, I am sorry for your loss because anyone who married Linda must have loved her very much. The money I am leaving you cannot bring Linda back, but I hope it can give you a chance to build a new life that honors her memory. Please know that you are now part of the Blackwood family, and you are loved and welcomed without reservation. Use this inheritance to do good in the world and know that somewhere, Linda is smiling down on both of us. Thomas was crying by the time Morrison finished reading. He had not cried since Linda's funeral. But something about hearing words of love and acceptance from a grandfather Linda never knew existed broke down all the walls he had built around his heart. Mr. Rivera, there are some legal papers we need to sign today to begin the transfer process, Morrison said gently. But first, we need to get you set up with some immediate necessities. We've arranged for you to stay at the Grandview Hotel downtown while you decide what you want to do long term. We've also arranged for you to have access to $50,000 immediately for clothes, meals, and anything else you need. Thomas looked up at Morrison with tears still in his eyes. Why are you being so kind to me? Why is everyone treating me like I'm important when yesterday I was just a homeless man living in a barn? Morrison smiled. Mr. Rivera, you were always important. Money doesn't make someone worthy of respect and kindness. But I will admit that your situation is quite remarkable. In 24 hours, you've gone from having nothing to being worth more than most Fortune 500 companies. It's going to take some time for that reality to sink in. As Thomas signed the legal documents that would change his life forever, he kept thinking about Linda. He wished she could be there to see this moment, to know that her family had been looking for her all along. But somehow Thomas felt like she was there with him, smiling and encouraging him to embrace this new chapter of his life. For the first time in 2 years, Thomas allowed himself to believe that maybe his story wasn't over. Maybe this was just the beginning of something wonderful and unexpected. Thomas sat in his hotel room at the Grandview, staring at the credit card and bank statements that Attorney Morrison had given him. The numbers seemed impossible. $50,000 available immediately, with millions more being processed. He kept reading the account balance over and over, thinking surely there had been some kind of mistake. The hotel room was nicer than any place Thomas had ever stayed, even during his boxing days when he was making good money. There was a king-size bed with soft white sheets, a bathroom with a marble shower and windows that looked out over the city skyline. Room service had brought him dinner, a real steak with vegetables and potatoes that he ate slowly, savoring every bite. But even surrounded by luxury, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this was all some elaborate mistake or cruel joke. He had been disappointed too many times to trust good news easily. Tomorrow morning, he was sure, someone would realize they had the wrong person and take it all away. His first stop the next day was the hotel's business center, where he spent 3 hours on the computer researching everything Catherine Wells and Attorney Morrison had told him. He looked up Harrison Blackwood and found dozens of newspaper articles about his real estate empire. There were obituaries from 6 months ago describing him as a wealthy philanthropist who had no known surviving family. Thomas found articles about Blackwood's shopping centers and office buildings, all of which matched the addresses on the documents Morrison had given him. He even found a video interview from 5 years ago, where Blackwood talked about searching for his estranged daughter and how much he regretted their family's broken relationship. Next, Thomas researched Catherine Wells and Morrison's law firm. Everything checked out. Wells was indeed a retired attorney who specialized in finding missing heirs, and Morrison's firm had an excellent reputation for handling large estates. But Thomas still couldn't believe that he was the person they had been looking for. The turning point came when Thomas decided to visit some of the properties he supposedly owned. He took a taxi to Blackwood Shopping Plaza, a large mall on the east side of the city. As the taxi pulled up, Thomas saw a maintenance crew working on the landscaping. He paid the driver and walked over to the workers. "Excuse me," Thomas said nervously. "Do you know who owns this shopping center?" One of the workers, an older man with paint-stained overalls, looked up. "Yeah, it belongs to the Blackwood estate. Old man Blackwood died a few months back, and now the lawyers are running everything until they find his heir." "Why do you ask?" Thomas felt his knees go weak. "Just curious." "Thank you." He walked through the shopping center in a daze. There were dozens of stores, clothing shops, restaurants, a grocery store, even a movie theater. Hundreds of people were shopping and working, and according to the lawyers, all of this belonged to him now. Thomas bought a coffee at one of the shops, and when he handed over the credit card Morrison had given him, it worked perfectly. The cashier smiled and thanked him, having no idea she was serving the new owner of the entire building. From the shopping center, Thomas took another taxi to one of the apartment complexes. Riverside Gardens was a beautiful collection of buildings surrounded by trees and walking paths. There was a leasing office near the entrance, and Thomas decided to go inside and ask about renting an apartment, just to see what would happen. The leasing agent was a friendly young woman named Beth, who showed Thomas floor plans and talked about amenities. When Thomas asked about the owner, Beth explained that the buildings had belonged to Harrison Blackwood, but now the estate was being managed by lawyers until the inheritance was settled. "It's such a sad story," Beth said. "Mr. Blackwood never had any family, and he spent years trying to find some distant relatives who might be out there somewhere. The lawyers are still looking, but they might not find anyone. Can you imagine having all that money and property and no one to leave it to?" Thomas almost laughed at the irony. Here was someone who worked at one of his properties, feeling sorry for Harrison Blackwood's loneliness, while the heir she was talking about was sitting right in front of her. That afternoon, Thomas called Morrison's office and asked for another meeting. This time he wanted to bring an independent lawyer to review everything and make sure he wasn't being taken advantage of somehow. Morrison was completely supportive of this idea and recommended several attorneys who could represent Thomas's interests. The independent lawyer, Jennifer Park, spent 2 days reviewing all the documents and verifying the inheritance. She called other law firms, checked court records, and even hired her own investigator to confirm the family connection between Linda and Harrison Blackwood. "Mr. Rivera," she told Thomas after her investigation was complete, "this is absolutely legitimate. In fact, it's one of the most straightforward inheritance cases I've ever seen. Mr. Blackwood's will is very clear. The family connection is well documented, and there are no other claimants to the estate. You are definitely Harrison Blackwood's sole heir." But Thomas still had doubts. What if there are other relatives out there who have a better claim than I do? What if someone comes forward and says they deserve the money more than I do? Jennifer shook her head. "Mr. Rivera, the estate lawyers have been advertising in newspapers for months trying to find any possible relatives. They've hired genealogy experts and private investigators. You are the only person with any legal claim to this inheritance. And even if someone else appeared tomorrow claiming to be related to Harrison Blackwood, they would need legal proof, and the will is very specific about the line of inheritance." Thomas's biggest concern was that people would think he was lying or trying to scam them. He had been treated like a worthless person for so long that it was hard to believe anyone would accept that he was suddenly wealthy. To test this, Thomas decided to go shopping for new clothes. He went to an expensive department store downtown, still wearing his old patched clothes and looking very much like a homeless person. The security guard followed him around the store, and the salespeople ignored him completely. Thomas picked out several nice shirts, pants, and a jacket, then took them to the checkout counter. The total came to over $800. When Thomas handed over his credit card, the cashier looked skeptical and asked for identification. Thomas showed his driver's license and the cashier called for a manager. "Sir, are you sure this card belongs to you?" the manager asked quietly. Thomas understood what was happening. Please run the card. If it doesn't work, I'll leave immediately. The manager ran the card through the system, and his expression changed completely when it was approved. I'm so sorry, sir. There was no problem with your card. Thank you for shopping with us, and please come back anytime. As Thomas walked out of the store with his new clothes, he realized that money really did change how people treated you. The same person who had been suspicious of him 5 minutes earlier was now practically bowing and calling him Sir. The final proof came when Morrison arranged for Thomas to visit Harrison Blackwood's mansion. The house was enormous, 15 rooms including a library, a music room, and a dining room that could seat 20 people. The grounds included gardens, a swimming pool, and even a small guest house. But what moved Thomas most was Harrison's study. The walls were covered with photographs and documents related to his search for Dorothy and Linda. There were maps with red pins marking places where investigators had looked, file folders full of research, and dozens of letters that Harrison had written to Linda but never sent. On the desk was a framed photograph of Linda that Morrison said Harrison had somehow obtained. It was from her college graduation, and she was smiling that beautiful smile that Thomas remembered so well. Next to the photo was a handwritten note that said, "I'm sorry I never got to meet you, granddaughter. I hope your husband knows how lucky he was to have you." Standing in that room, surrounded by evidence of Harrison's love for the granddaughter he never met, Thomas finally accepted that this inheritance was real. It wasn't a mistake or a scam. It was the gift of a lonely old man who wanted to make sure that Linda's husband was taken care of, even though Harrison himself would never get the chance to welcome them into his family. Thomas picked up the photograph of Linda and held it carefully. "I wish you could see this," he whispered. "I wish you could know that your grandfather was looking for you all along, that you did have family who loved you." As he stood in Harrison Blackwood's study, Thomas began to understand that this inheritance wasn't just about money. It was about belonging to something bigger than himself, about carrying on the legacy of a man who had worked his whole life to build something meaningful. And most importantly, it was about having the resources to live in a way that would make Linda proud of him. For the first time since Linda's death, Thomas felt like he had a purpose again. He didn't know exactly what he would do with Harrison's fortune, but he knew he wanted to use it to help other people who were struggling the way he had struggled. He wanted to make sure that no one else would have to choose between keeping their home and paying for medical bills. Thomas was finally ready to stop being a victim of circumstances and start being the man Linda had always believed he could be. The news traveled through the small town like wildfire. Someone at the bank had noticed the large deposits going into Thomas Rivera's account, and by the end of the week, everyone knew that the homeless man from the barn had somehow become incredibly wealthy. The rumors grew bigger with each telling. Some people said he had won the lottery. Others thought he must have been involved in something illegal. Thomas's first indication that word was spreading came when he returned to the gas station to thank Pete for letting him use the phone. Pete's attitude was completely different from just a week before. Instead of the casual friendliness he had always shown, Pete was now almost formal, treating Thomas like an important customer rather than someone he was helping out of kindness. "Mr. Rivera," Pete said, emphasizing the formal address, "I heard about your good fortune. That's wonderful news. If there's anything I can do for you, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." Thomas felt uncomfortable with the change. "Pete, you can still call me Thomas. You've been good to me when nobody else was, and I won't forget that." But Pete seemed determined to maintain the new formal relationship. "Of course, Mr. Rivera, and please know that you'll always be welcome here." The transformation in how people treated him was dramatic and immediate. Thomas decided to visit some of the places where he had been ignored or mistreated, partly out of curiosity, and partly to test whether the change in people's behavior was real. His first stop was the grocery store where the security guard used to follow him around. Thomas walked through the front door wearing his new clothes, and the same security guard who had watched him suspiciously now nodded politely and said, "Good afternoon, sir." The cashiers who had barely looked at him before now smiled and made small talk about the weather. Thomas bought the same items he used to buy when he had a few dollars: bread, peanut butter, and canned soup. But now when he paid with his credit card, the cashier thanked him warmly and asked if he had found everything he needed. The security guard even held the door open for him as he left. At the barber shop, Tony's reaction was the most dramatic of all. When Thomas walked in, Tony immediately stopped cutting his customer's hair and rushed over. "Thomas!" I heard the amazing news. "Congratulations, my friend." Tony acted like they had always been close, like he hadn't ignored Thomas when he walked past the shop window just 2 weeks earlier. "I was wondering if you might have time for a haircut," Thomas said simply. "Of course. Right away. Please sit in my best chair." Tony made a big show of preparing his station and talking loudly enough for everyone in the shop to hear about how he had always known Thomas was destined for great things. While Tony cut his hair, Thomas listened to the other customers talking about his sudden wealth. They spoke about him like he was a celebrity, speculating about what he would do with all his money and whether he would stay in town or move somewhere more exciting. The most surprising reaction came from the teenagers who had been tormenting him at the barn. A group of them approached Thomas on the street and he tensed up, expecting more harassment. But instead they were polite and almost apologetic. "Mr. Rivera," one of them said respectfully, "we heard about your inheritance. That's really cool. We were wondering if you might need any help with yard work or anything around your new house." Thomas looked at these kids who had called him names and thrown rocks at his shelter just weeks before. Now they wanted to work for him, to be associated with his success. He felt a mixture of sadness and irony at how quickly their attitudes had changed. "I appreciate the offer," Thomas said calmly, "but I think I'll be fine for now." The transformation wasn't limited to strangers. People who had known Thomas during his boxing days suddenly reappeared in his life. Jerry, the former training partner who had driven away when he saw Thomas collecting cans, called the hotel and asked to meet for lunch. "Tommy, buddy, I've been thinking about you and wondering how you were doing," Jerry said when they met at an expensive restaurant downtown. "I heard about your incredible luck. Man, you deserve this after everything you've been through." Thomas remembered Jerry's embarrassed reaction when they had met on the highway, but he decided not to bring it up. Instead, he listened as Jerry talked about old times and suggested they should train together again. Maybe even start a boxing gym as partners. "You know, Tommy, I've got some great ideas for investments if you're interested. Real estate deals, business opportunities. We could make your money work for you." Thomas realized that Jerry wasn't interested in their friendship. He was interested in Thomas's money. It was a pattern he was starting to notice with many people who were suddenly being friendly to him. The local newspaper wanted to do a story about Thomas's transformation from homeless to millionaire. The reporter, a young woman named Lisa, met him at the hotel coffee shop and asked questions about how it felt to go from having nothing to having everything. "Mr. Rivera, this is such an inspiring story. Our readers would love to know how you're handling such a dramatic change in circumstances. What's the first thing you plan to do with your inheritance?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. "I'm still trying to process everything that's happened. It's overwhelming to go from worrying about where your next meal is coming from to suddenly having more money than you could spend in several lifetimes. Are you planning to stay in town, or will you move somewhere more suited to your new lifestyle?" Thomas hadn't really thought about moving. "This is where Linda and I built our life together. I'm not sure I want to leave all those memories behind." What would you say to people who think you don't deserve this inheritance? There are some folks in town saying that money should go to someone who earned it, rather than just inheriting it. Thomas was surprised by the question, but he realized there probably were people who resented his good fortune. "I would say that I never asked for this inheritance and I didn't even know it existed until a week ago. But I plan to use it responsibly and in a way that would make my late wife proud." After the interview, Thomas reflected on how complicated his new situation was becoming. People were treating him completely differently, but he couldn't tell who was being genuine and who was just interested in his money. The respect and attention felt good after years of being ignored, but it also felt hollow because he knew it was based on his bank account rather than who he was as a person. The most difficult encounter came when Thomas decided to visit Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had been one of the few people to treat him kindly when he was homeless. He wanted to thank her and perhaps help her with any needs she might have. But when Thomas knocked on her door, Mrs. Patterson's reaction was not what he expected. She seemed nervous and uncomfortable, quite different from the warm, motherly way she had treated him before. "Oh, Thomas, I heard about your situation. How wonderful for you. Mrs. Patterson, I wanted to thank you for being kind to me when I needed work. You treated me with dignity when most people didn't." She fidgeted with her hands and didn't invite him inside like she always had before. "Well, you were always a good worker. I hope you'll be very happy with your new life." Thomas realized that Mrs. Patterson was now uncomfortable around him because of the difference in their economic situations. When he was homeless, she could treat him as someone she was helping. Now that he was wealthy, she didn't know how to relate to him anymore. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm still the same person I was last month. I hope we can still be friends," she smiled, but it was forced. "Of course, dear. You take care of yourself." As Thomas walked away from Mrs. Patterson's house, he understood that his inheritance had changed more than just his bank account. It had changed every relationship he had, and every interaction he would have going forward. People would always see his money first and him second. That evening, sitting alone in his luxury hotel room, Thomas felt more isolated than he had even when he was living in the barn. At least then, the few people who were kind to him were being genuine. Now he couldn't tell who really cared about him and who was just interested in what he could do for them. Thomas looked at the framed photo of Linda that he had brought from Harrison's study. "I wish you were here to help me figure this out," he said to her picture. "I never wanted to be rich. I just wanted us to be happy together." He realized that having money solved some problems but created others. He would never have to worry about food or shelter again, but he might spend the rest of his life wondering whether people liked him for himself or for his wealth. The transformation was complete on the outside. Thomas looked and lived like a wealthy man. But inside, he was still trying to figure out who he was supposed to be now that everything in his life had changed. The journey from homeless to millionaire had taken only a week, but Thomas suspected that learning how to live with his new reality would take much longer. 3 months after learning about his inheritance, Thomas was still living in the hotel, unable to decide what to do next. He had more money than he could ever spend, but he felt emptier than he had even during his darkest days in the barn. The wealth that was supposed to solve all his problems had created new ones he never expected. Everything changed the day Thomas received a phone call from a woman named Carol Jenkins. She was crying when she introduced herself, and Thomas almost hung up, thinking it was another person trying to get money from him. "Mr. Rivera, I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to call. My husband is dying of cancer, and we're about to lose our house because of the medical bills. Someone at the hospital told me that you might understand what we're going through because you lost your wife the same way." Thomas felt like he had been hit in the chest. Carol's situation was exactly what he and Linda had faced, and hearing about it brought back all the helplessness and desperation he had felt watching Linda suffer while drowning in debt. "Tell me about your husband," Thomas said. Gently, Carol explained that her husband David was a construction worker who had been diagnosed with lung cancer 6 months earlier. They had insurance, but it didn't cover all the experimental treatments that might save his life. They had already sold their car and borrowed against their house, but they still owed over $100,000 to various doctors and hospitals. "We have 2 teenage children," Carol continued through her tears. "If we lose the house, I don't know where we'll go. David is so worried about leaving us with all this debt that he's talking about stopping his treatments. He says maybe it would be better if he just died quickly instead of slowly bankrupting our family." Thomas knew exactly how David felt. He had watched Linda struggle with the same guilt, feeling like her illness was destroying their life together. He had seen the look in her eyes when she suggested maybe they should stop fighting and just accept that there wasn't enough money to save her. "Carol, what if I told you that you don't have to worry about the medical bills anymore?" There was silence on the phone, then Carol said quietly, "I don't understand. I want to pay off all your husband's medical debt. All of it. And I want to make sure you don't lose your house." Carol started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief and disbelief. "Mr. Rivera, that's over $100,000. Why would you do that for people you don't even know?" Thomas thought about Linda and how she had always wanted to help other people, even when they had nothing to give. "Because I know what it's like to watch someone you love suffer while you're powerless to help them. Because no one should have to choose between keeping their home and saving their spouse's life." That phone call changed everything for Thomas. He realized that his inheritance wasn't just money, it was power. The power to solve problems that seemed impossible to other people. The power to give families hope when they had none left. Within a week, Thomas had paid off David Jenkins's medical bills and set up a trust fund to cover any future treatments he might need. He also paid off their mortgage so that Carol and her children would never have to worry about losing their home. regardless of what happened to David. But Thomas didn't stop there. He asked Attorney Morrison to help him research other families in similar situations. They found dozens of people in the area who were facing the same impossible choice between medical care and financial survival. There was Rita Gonzalez, a single mother whose 8-year-old daughter needed heart surgery that insurance wouldn't fully cover. Thomas paid for the surgery and created a college fund for the little girl. There was elderly Frank Cooper, who couldn't afford his diabetes medication and was rationing his insulin, slowly killing himself to save money. Thomas not only paid for Frank's medication, but arranged for a home health aide to help him manage his condition. There was the Martinez family, who had lost everything when their son was diagnosed with leukemia. Thomas paid their medical bills and bought them a new house, telling them it was an early Christmas present from someone who understood their pain. Each family Thomas helped reminded him of his own struggle with Linda's illness. But now, instead of feeling helpless and angry about their situation, he felt grateful that he could prevent other people from experiencing the same desperation. Thomas decided to make his giving more organized and sustainable. He worked with Morrison to establish the Linda Rivera Foundation, named after his wife and dedicated to helping families dealing with medical crises. The foundation would pay medical bills, provide housing assistance, and offer emotional support to people facing what Thomas and Linda had faced. But Thomas's most meaningful project was what he decided to do with the old barn where he had lived when he was homeless. Instead of tearing it down or selling the property, Thomas bought the land from the abandoned farm and completely renovated the barn into something beautiful and useful. The renovated barn became the Linda Rivera Community Center, a place where struggling families could come for help and support. The main room, where Thomas had once slept on hay bales, was transformed into a meeting space for support groups and community dinners. There were offices for social workers and counselors, a food pantry, and even a small medical clinic where people without insurance could receive basic care. Thomas kept one small room in the barn exactly as it had been when he lived there. He put up a simple plaque that read, "This room is preserved to remind us that anyone can face hard times, and everyone deserves dignity and hope." He wanted people to understand that the difference between being homeless and being housed was often just one medical bill or one lost job. The transformation of the barn became a symbol throughout the community. Teenagers who had once thrown rocks at Thomas now volunteered at the community center, helping to serve meals and organize donations. Local businesses started contributing supplies and services, inspired by Thomas's example of using wealth to help others rather than just accumulate more possessions. Thomas also started a scholarship program for students whose families were dealing with medical crises. He remembered how hard it had been to focus on work when Linda was sick, and he wanted to make sure that children didn't have to give up their education because their parents were facing health problems. One of the first scholarship recipients was Carol Jenkins's daughter, who wanted to become a nurse so she could help other families like hers. When Thomas met her at the scholarship ceremony, she told him, "Mr. Rivera, you saved my dad's life, but you also saved our whole family. Now I want to spend my life doing the same thing for other people." Thomas started speaking at hospitals and medical conferences, sharing his story and encouraging other wealthy people to support families facing medical bankruptcies. He talked about how losing everything had taught him what really mattered in life, and how having wealth meant nothing if you didn't use it to make other people's lives better. "Money can't bring back the people we've lost," Thomas would tell his audiences, "but it can prevent other families from losing everything while they're trying to save someone they love. It can give people hope when they think they're out of options." The foundation grew quickly, helping hundreds of families in its first year. Thomas hired staff members who had personal experience with medical crises, including several people who had been homeless themselves. He wanted the foundation to be run by people who truly understood what their clients were going through. Thomas also established a special fund to help other homeless individuals get back on their feet. He provided job training, temporary housing, and mental health services, remembering how difficult it had been to escape homelessness once you were trapped in it. One day, while Thomas was visiting the community center, he met a man named Robert who reminded him of himself during his darkest days. Robert had lost his job and his apartment after his wife died in a car accident, and he had been living in his car for 3 months. "I used to be somebody," Robert told Thomas. "I had a house, a good job, people who respected me. Now I'm invisible. People look right through me like I don't exist." Thomas sat with Robert and shared his own story, explaining how he had gone from being a successful boxer to living in a barn, and eventually to inheriting a fortune. "The most important thing I learned," Thomas told him, "is that your worth as a person doesn't change based on how much money you have or where you sleep at night. You were somebody before you lost your job, and you're still somebody now." Thomas helped Robert find a job and an apartment, but more importantly, he helped him restore his sense of dignity and self-worth. 6 months later, Robert became a volunteer at the community center, helping other people who were facing the same struggles he had overcome. Working with the foundation and the community center gave Thomas a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Linda died. Every family he helped, every person he lifted out of desperation, felt like a way of honoring Linda's memory and Harrison Blackwood's legacy. Thomas realized that his inheritance had given him something much more valuable than money. It had given him the ability to be the person Linda had always believed he could be, someone who used his strength to protect and help others, someone who made the world a little bit better just by being in it. 2 years had passed since Catherine Wells first appeared at the old barn with news that changed Thomas's life forever. As he stood in the main room of the Linda Rivera Community Center, watching families share a Thanksgiving dinner, Thomas reflected on how much everything had changed, not just his circumstances, but his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. The community center was bustling with activity. Volunteers were serving turkey and all the traditional holiday foods to anyone who needed a meal or simply wanted to share the holiday with others. Some of the guests were homeless individuals who had nowhere else to go. Others were families struggling with medical bills or job loss. Still others were longtime community members who came because they enjoyed being part of something positive and welcoming. Thomas watched Carol Jenkins helping to serve dessert to a table full of children. Her husband David had beaten his cancer and was back to work, thanks to the treatments that Thomas's foundation had made possible. Their daughter was thriving in college, studying to become a nurse just as she had promised. Carol now worked as a coordinator for the foundation, helping other families navigate the same crisis that had once threatened to destroy her own. At another table, Thomas saw Robert, the man who had been living in his car when they first met. Robert was now the assistant director of the center's job placement program, helping other people transition from homelessness to stable employment. He was sitting with his new girlfriend, a teacher who had volunteered at the center and fallen in love with Robert's kindness and determination to help others. The teenagers who had once tormented Thomas at the barn were now young adults, and several of them had become regular volunteers at the center. One of them, a young man named Kevin, approached Thomas during the dinner. "Mr. Rivera, I wanted to thank you again for giving me a chance to volunteer here when I was in high school. Working at the center changed my whole perspective on life. I'm starting medical school next year, and I want to specialize in helping low-income patients." Thomas shook Kevin's hand warmly. "I'm proud of you, Kevin, and I'm grateful that you learned from your mistakes instead of being defined by them." The mayor of the town, who had once been embarrassed by having a homeless camp in the area, now pointed to the community center as one of the city's greatest success stories. She often brought visitors to see how Thomas had transformed a symbol of poverty into a beacon of hope and community support. "Mr. Rivera," the mayor said, joining Thomas as he observed the dinner, "I have some wonderful news to share with you. The state government wants to use your community center as a model for other cities. They're offering grants to help establish similar programs across the state." Thomas smiled. "That's fantastic news. The more places that can offer this kind of support, the fewer families will have to go through what Linda and I went through." Thomas had also become a sought-after speaker at conferences about poverty, homelessness, and healthcare reform. His story resonated with audiences because he spoke from personal experience about both sides of the economic divide. He had been both the person who needed help and the person with the resources to provide it. "The biggest lesson I've learned," Thomas would tell his audiences, "is that none of us are immune to life's hardest challenges. A medical diagnosis, a job loss, a family tragedy, any of these things can change everything overnight. The question isn't whether difficult times will come. The question is whether we'll help each other get through them." Thomas had moved out of the hotel and into Harrison Blackwood's mansion, but he had transformed it into something Harrison would have been proud of. Half of the house remained a private residence where Thomas lived simply, keeping only what he needed. The other half had been converted into meeting spaces and offices for the Foundation's expanded operations. The mansion's beautiful gardens were now used for community events and fundraisers. Thomas had added a memorial garden dedicated to Linda and Harrison, where people could come to reflect quietly or remember loved ones they had lost. The garden included a plaque with Linda's favorite quote, "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle." Harrison's study remained largely unchanged, but Thomas had added new photographs showing the impact of the Foundation's work. Pictures of families who had been helped, children who had received scholarships, and community events at the center filled the walls alongside Harrison's original research about his family. Thomas felt like he was continuing the connection that Harrison had always wanted to have with his granddaughter and her family. Thomas had also reconnected with some of his old boxing friends, but on different terms than before. Those who had sought him out purely for financial gain had gradually faded away when they realized he wasn't interested in get-rich-quick schemes or flashy investments. The friends who remained were those who appreciated the person Thomas had become, rather than just the money he had inherited. Jerry, his former training partner, had eventually apologized for his behavior when Thomas was homeless. "I was embarrassed by my own reaction when I saw you collecting cans that day," Jerry admitted. "I should have helped you instead of driving away. I let my discomfort with your situation prevent me from being a good friend." Thomas had forgiven Jerry, and they now worked together on a youth boxing program at the community center. The program taught boxing skills to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, but more importantly, it taught discipline, confidence, and respect. Thomas often told the young boxers that real strength meant protecting people who were vulnerable, not taking advantage of them. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had been kind to Thomas when he was homeless but then became uncomfortable around his wealth, had eventually come around. She now volunteered at the community center's food pantry and had become one of Thomas's closest friends. She told him that she had been intimidated by his sudden wealth because she was afraid he would change into someone different. "I'm glad to see that you're still the same kind man who used to work in my yard," she told Thomas. "Money didn't make you different. It just gave you more ways to show who you really are." The barn that had once sheltered Thomas during his lowest point was now the heart of a thriving community support system. The Foundation had helped over 1,000 families avoid medical bankruptcy, provided housing assistance to hundreds of people, and offered job training and placement services to anyone who needed them. Thomas had also established an endowment that would ensure the Foundation's work could continue long after he was gone. He wanted to make sure that future generations would have the same safety net that he had been able to provide, so that no one would have to face medical bankruptcy or homelessness alone. On this Thanksgiving evening, as Thomas watched people from all walks of life sharing a meal together, he felt a deep sense of gratitude that had nothing to do with his wealth. He was grateful for Linda's love, which had taught him what really mattered in life. He was grateful for Harrison's generosity, which had given him the tools to make a difference. And he was grateful for the difficult times he had endured, because they had taught him compassion and humility. Pete from the gas station approached Thomas during the dinner. Over the past 2 years, Pete had gradually returned to treating Thomas the way he always had, with genuine friendliness rather than formal deference. "Thomas, I wanted you to know that my nephew Jake is one of the scholarship recipients from your foundation. He's studying to be a paramedic now. You've changed so many lives in this community." Thomas appreciated Pete's words, but he had learned to be uncomfortable with too much praise. The Foundation is just returning Harrison's money to the community, where it can do the most good. "I'm just the messenger." As the evening wound down and families began to leave with containers of leftover food, Thomas helped clean up alongside the other volunteers. He had learned that staying connected to the day-to-day work of the Foundation kept him grounded and reminded him of why the work mattered. Catherine Wells, the lawyer who had first found Thomas at the barn, had become a good friend and advisor to the Foundation. She stopped by the center regularly to check on their progress and offer legal guidance for their expanding programs. "Thomas," she said as they stacked chairs together, "I've been thinking about Harrison's letter again, the one he wrote for Linda's husband. He said he hoped you would use the inheritance to do good in the world. I think he would be amazed at what you've accomplished. Thomas paused in his work. I hope so. Sometimes I wonder what Linda would think about all this. She always wanted to help people, but she never had the resources to do it on this scale. Catherine smiled. I think Linda would be proud that you found a way to turn your pain into purpose. That's not something everyone can do, regardless of how much money they have. As Thomas drove home to the mansion that evening, he took a detour past the old barn location. Even though it was now the community center, he still thought of it as the barn sometimes. In the darkness, he could see the warm lights from inside where a few staff members were finishing up the evening's cleanup. 2 years ago, Thomas had been sleeping in that same building, cold and hungry and forgotten by most of the world. Tonight, that building was a symbol of hope and community support.